My editor came up to me and he was like, the thing that you do that is special is tell us who is important that we should be listening to and then understand what the hell they're saying. These are all the people who have helped me answer this title, What If We Get It Right question, who have helped me see the way forward, their visions of climate futures. And so I'm offering that to all of the readers, these conversations about sort of the mess we're in and how they can see us finding our way out of it and what we get at the other end. This book is very much like, show me it's worth it.
Hi, folks. I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. As I teased at the end of last week, today's episode is a very special one for me because I get to sit down in the studio in real life with one of my very best and very oldest friends, and now I get to introduce her and her amazing work to all of you. So today, my guest is Dr. Ayana Johnson. And she's just written an incredible new book called What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures. I've known Ayana for 26 years now, through some truly memorable times in both of our lives. It was the fall of 1998 when we first met as college freshmen at Harvard. We were both meeting as many new people as possible, making friends in this strange place, having as much fun as the Ivies permit, which included one of my favorite memories, when Ayana serenaded me for Secret Santa in the freshman dorms to Fire by the Pointer Sisters. Turns out she has an incredible voice and is an amazing jazz vocalist. Well, by junior and senior year, we were part of a big group of co-ed roommates in Kirkland House. We've been close friends ever since. Over the decades, our paths have gone in various directions. I went down the banking rabbit hole while she earned a PhD in marine biology, scuba diving in the Caribbean, and helping pioneer more sustainable fishing techniques, which is not something I'm jealous of at all, right? If it were anyone else, for sure. But with Ayana, it's just kind of like, yeah, of course she's having an amazing adventure, helping preserve beautiful places and helping people on the way. That's exactly what she should be doing. And she's had plenty of other fascinating adventures along the way, too. She's interfaced with Caribbean heads of state as the executive director of the Waite Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to ocean sustainability. She's taught as a professor of environmental studies at NYU. She's founded and run not one, but two impactful ocean health-focused policy think tanks, the Ocean Collective and Urban Ocean Lab. And she's been an amazing communicator for issues around climate and ocean science, sustainability, and social justice as a writer, editor, speaker, and programmer. She even co-created and hosted her own podcast, How to Save a Planet, which I highly recommend. Go listen after the show. It's so great. But through all those changing roles, there's always been one that's constant. She's been my friend. She brings an energy and a vivaciousness to life that's loved by anyone who shares a room with her. Quite simply, she is amazing. And I'm so lucky to have her as a friend for so long. So when I heard about her new book, the whole premise basically answering the question I ask every guest, how do we defeat defeatism when it comes to climate? I knew the time had come to get her onto my podcast to talk about it. So without further ado, I'm so happy and so proud to share my conversation with the brilliant and inimitable scientist, founder, author, and my dear friend, Dr. Ayana Johnson. Let's dive in. Sorry, couldn't resist the pun.
You look nervous. Don't be nervous.
I don't know. Because you're so smart. What would you want?
We went to college together, you goober.
So the questions to think about, what would you want, like, business?
Just imagine me in the dining hall being like, how many bagels is it okay to eat? And then you will not be nervous anymore.
Ready?
Ready.
Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
So for backstory for folks, this is Ayana Johnson, who is a brilliant doctor, PhD in marine biology, and also one of my amazing college roommates.
This is my claim to fame. We lived together in some very formative years.
The most formative, I would say, probably.
And maybe among the most fun.
I think certainly.
Pretty delightful.
It only went downhill when I went into the finance world, so...
I do remember that phase. Like, what? You're doing what? Why? Okay, I hope it's just a phase.
It was. Although some things about finance never left me, like my love of spreadsheets.
I do love a spreadsheet.
See?
Yeah.
There's some commonalities. I want to start by giving folks a little bit of background to you. So let's just begin with tell everyone a little about yourself. And we want to tease this book that you wrote. We'll talk a lot about it, but the introduction gives such a beautiful story. So tell us about you and your lifelong love affair with the ocean.
I mean, the ocean is so easy to love, right?
It
Especially when it's warm. And I had this opportunity as a child to go and swim around the Caribbean. That's where I learned to swim, in the Florida Keys. And how do you not fall in love with that? When you see a coral reef through a glass bottom boat and you're like, excuse me, how come no one told me there was all this rainbow excitement, fish, corals happening down there? So that was the start of it when I was 5. And I was like, a marine biologist is a job? Yes, please.
I feel like I went through a marine biologist phase shortly after visiting SeaWorld, probably when I was 8 or 9.
Yeah. It's a super common dream job for kids. I'm just I guess uncommonly stubborn or something. And I was like, yep, nope, still. I mean, I'm going to just take a little credit for making good life decisions to study abroad in Turks and Caicos.
Yeah, that was brilliant.
And it was great. It was super informative. I was on South Caicos, which is at the time, it's probably more developed now, but it was just a fishing village of just a few hundred people. And I was studying the effectiveness of East Harbor Lobster and Conch Reserve to try to understand, was this an effective fisheries management conservation tool? Snorkeling all the time, learning the Latin names of all these different species, learning the natural resource economics of it all. And it was just a great introduction to how ocean conservation requires all these different disciplines. And my major in college was environmental science and public policy. And so it was perfect as a way to think about applying all these different academic disciplines to helping to make the ocean resplendent once again.
I know, because I was with you, that you always had the deep-seated passion, and it was kind of a path that you were likely to pursue. I had the opposite, right, where I was lost and did this and did that, and just, And I feel like I talk to a lot of younger folks now, and this idea of we should know what we want to do when we grow up is so foreign to me.
Yeah.
But you kind of had it in a way.
Sort of. I mean, my life seems very linear in hindsight, but I never really had a long-term plan. And actually talking to you reminds me that it was my roommate who was the head of the campus environmental club. And I never went to one meeting. I was not committed in that way. It was a theoretical interest and commitment. And I had all sorts of other dream jobs, right? That was the 5-year-old one. And then I was obsessed with jazz singing, and I loved modern dance, and I had all these hobbies. And I didn't think those would become careers, but they were very big commitments of mine. And, I learned about the civil rights movement in school, and I was I want to be the lawyer that gets the next Martin Luther King out of jail. And then I wanted to be an environmental lawyer. And then I wanted to be a park ranger, right? And then there was this realization, in part because of that study abroad program with the School for Field Studies, that you could really combine literally all of those dream jobs, and that would be ocean conservation. And so I've sort of made a career out of being a generalist in some ways, or just never really choosing, and having this portfolio of projects that lets me kind of think about all these different pieces of the puzzle, which has been super delightful. So yeah, it looks like a cute linear story in hindsight, but definitely I'm what about this? What about this?
Right.
What about a book? What about a think tank? What about field work? What about policy? What about communications? And it's just been this process of trying to figure out how I can be most useful, which I know is the same process you've gone through in different fields too.
So funny, because we've had this theme that I've picked up on with a bunch of really smart, innovative CEOs and a bunch of interviews, this conversation around the generalist and leadership from generalists versus leadership from specialists, and how it's okay to pursue a generalist path.
Yeah. Someone's got to connect the damn dots,
Yeah.
I will say I've been thinking about this a lot lately as I'm, preparing for book launch and all this minutia that goes along with that, the spreadsheets with literally 20 tabs. There is sort of this blessing curse of I am both a generalist and incredibly detail-oriented, which is required for writing a book.
Yeah.
But also the big what if questions and the futurism and all of that. So it's sort of innately being a big picture in love with ideas person, but also wanting the execution to be flawless, results in some level of like insane workaholism and
Wouldn't know what you're talking about.
It's like a little bit tricky. I ended up becoming the art director for the book because I was like, the design of the thing is so important to the message being effectively received that I'm going to need to jump in here too.
Yeah. The design is beautiful.
Thank you.
By the way. Before we pivot off of college, though, I did...
Let's fully reminisce.
We don't need to go into all the way down the rabbit
bring it
hole
on.
because that wouldn't be fun for anyone but you and me, probably. But hindsight where it is now, what do you think back about the college experience and reflect on as like, this was formative in who I became, particularly who I became kind of in a professional setting, who I became as a writer, who I became as a professor, who I became as a think tank leader. Like what from our college experience kind of, do you look back on and think, those were some of the moments that helped set the stage?
Yeah. I was not a good student in college. I just was not devoted to my studies. I didn't really do a large percentage of the readings. I didn't study that hard. I got a postcard from my mother at one point that was like a romantic painting of like a woman reading a book in a window seat. And she was like, I've heard the inside of the libraries at Harvard are very nice. Maybe you should check them out sometime. The shade. And I didn't have the kind of like rich social life that I might have wanted in high school. I had lots of cool friends and, had people to hang out with and like giggle on the phone with late at night and all that kind of stuff. But I wasn't cool. And getting to college and being invited to parties, I was like, why would I not go to any of these? Like, clearly I'm going to everything I'm invited to. And that took precedence for me over reading. I was like, I have like cool roommates I could hang out with and talk to. And it's just, there's not enough hours in the day.
Yeah.
And so for me, college was very much like a social evolution. Like my dad was like, you learned how to go to cocktail parties? Like, what did you learn in college? And the answer is kind of like, yes.
Right.
Which turns out to be a very important life skill.
Yeah.
And I have become increasingly more introverted every year since graduating. But for the 15 years that I did manage to go out and meet people all the time, that has absolutely changed the trajectory of my life, right? Because so much of business, I think a lot of executives you've talked to would probably agree, is conducted over text message. It's not emails. It's not through assistants. It's like, can I text you and then we can just get this thing done? And so having a network like that is all about just like having had even one delightful experience with someone in person, right? And that I think was the most important thing I learned in college was like how to sort of improvise at parties, and how to like make fun together.
Right.
How to sort of embrace the whimsy and delight and absurdity of it all together. But I'd also say, having chosen Harvard in part because of this interdisciplinary major was a big deal. It was the invitation I needed from a very early age intellectually to not have to specialize, to, take atmospheric chemistry and ecology and statistics and organic chemistry that I barely passed and environmental law at Harvard Law School and environmental economics at the Kennedy School, and just this chance to really like understand the web of knowledge that's required to start to chart a path forward. So, it was mostly social, but I also got this sense of the world. And that study abroad semester was really important because I ended up working for almost a decade after college in the Caribbean with fishing communities in Curacao and Bonaire and Antigua and Barbuda and Montserrat.
And doing some incredible stuff. One of my favorite Ayana-isms is
God, where is this going?
I believe it's a patent.
Okay.
Your patent on a smart new fishing device.
Yeah. I built a better fish trap.
Yeah.
Basically, it is not patented.
Not patented, okay.
On purpose because I wanted people to use it for free without worrying or licensing or anything. It's sort of silly to even call it a brand new design because it's basically like a rectangular slot in the corner of a fish trap that lets the baby fish and the sort of narrow-bodied ornamental species, the Nemo-y ones, get out. Because fishermen didn't want them anyway. They weren't really valuable. So if the groupers and snappers, wider-bodied, larger fish stay in, they can still make a living, and you have this conservation benefit. And it just costs like a few dollars to retrofit an existing trap with like rebar and zip ties, like extremely low tech. But working with fishermen in Curacao on that and working with the fisheries department there was so formative because you realize that not everything has to be big and complicated. I mean, it took me something like 300 scuba dives to prove that this trap design would work on different reefs and testing out different patterns to prove scientifically, statistically, rigorously, that there was a difference in these trap designs and this one would have all these conservation benefits without hurting fishermen's incomes. And being able to bring in the economics of it too was what made that government and other island governments embrace this design. So it's now, required by law in a handful of different places, which is like pretty cool for the first chapter of your PhD dissertation and totally addictive. You're like, wait a second, we could do like a simple thing and then the laws change and then the ocean might be a little bit better for it. Like, what are we doing next?
What have you, I mean, you've gotten to know quite a few heads of state from the islands.
I've met some of them. I wouldn't say I know them, but yeah.
Has there been any kind of overarching trends, lessons learned, or themes you've picked up kind of in those relationships and those conversations?
I mean, it's funny, like all these hip hop lyrics about cash rules everything around me are like coming to mind.
I mean, drop the lyrics.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to the money, whether it's rainy or snowy or sunny is the lyric I'm thinking of right now. A lot of Caribbean economies are so heavily based on tourism, and that drives so many political decisions. So many of the jobs are in that sector, which is really unfortunate. And so it just made me, I was constantly thinking like how this sector is so powerful, which means that foreign interests and foreign money often is very powerful. And so there's this dependence that leads to islands having to make decisions they would not otherwise be making, which is really difficult to see and, difficult for politicians to navigate. Especially because tourism can often be unsustainable in places that are dependent on their natural resources. And even the tourism is dependent on the quality of the reefs and the quality of the water and air and seagrasses and mangroves and all of it. So it's really this tricky push and pull. And now we're getting into the phase where a lot of those Caribbean islands are bearing a disproportionately large brunt of climate impacts, whether that's storms, sea level rise, et cetera, which is very expensive to deal with. And so you have tourism-based economies that are being pummeled by climate change, which then like reduces tourist visits. And it's this sort of downward spiral where they're taking out these major international loans that they're not able to repay, but climate change isn't their fault, but they're having to pay for it. And it's this sort of debt trap, which is just wildly unjust. And so leaders like Mia Motley from Barbados are trying to think about new ways to structure, restructure, and eliminate debt because there's just no way forward if you're just continually getting in deeper and deeper debt to dig out of these climate problems.
Which is a chapter in the book.
Which is absolutely covered in the book.
Begin previewing the book here and there. Okay, let's kind of skip through all of your jobs, except for, are there any that like stand out as most fun? Well, because otherwise we'll be here forever. And I want to talk about the book.
Jobs. I mean, the most like interesting thing about jobs is that I'm not like really good at having jobs. Like full-time 9-to-5 jobs.
Yeah. Not
really my jam. I'm willing to work extremely hard, long hours, pay attention to the details, I love to collaborate, all of that. But I can't even sit in a chair properly. Can you imagine me trying to like sit in a cubicle? So I've been lucky enough to be able to fashion a portfolio of projects for myself that are exciting and worthwhile and that I have a lot of say in shaping.
Yeah. One of which I do want to spend a minute on, which is the podcast, How to Save a Planet, that you did a couple years ago now, 2 years ago, which is amazing.
Launched in 2020, recorded in my bedroom at my mom's farm. which was a whole other adventure of like, oh, I'm now an audio engineer because of the pandemic.
Did you have a favorite episode or a most unexpected kind of takeaway from that? I actually did, and there's one that it's really relevant to me, but I'm curious what yours would have been.
Okay, I definitely want to hear what yours is. The one that I keep coming back to lately is the one that was reported by Kendra Pierre-Louis called Where's My Climate Anthem? About the lack of good music for the climate movement. We just don't have anthems. And she compared that to the history of the civil rights movement, where music was such a big part of it. It was really infused into culture in these beautiful ways, in these unifying ways. And we just simply do not have that. And so that episode was an exploration of why. And she interviewed people like Pitbull, who wrote an album called Climate Change, which I hadn't known. And I talked about my, at the time, favorite sort of climate or environmental song, which is New World Water by Mos Def. And I think I like rap a little bit in that episode, which is not my forte. But, I had some points to get across, so I was willing to do it. Yeah, and I thought about that a lot. And actually, the last page of this book...
Yes, I was going to say...
is the Anti-Apocalypse playlist, which you can listen to on Apple or Spotify, because I've had to sort of appropriate music and reinterpret the lyrics as applying to climate change. And so love songs become love songs to the earth, or heartbreak about what's happening to the earth. And the sort of the rowdy anthems for victory become about wins that we need to have or are having in climate, and the sort of tunes for tenacity, I call it, the like fight songs, right? And then, everything needs a little sex appeal. So there's sort of like the sexy implementation vibes, because as you know, like implementation is like, oh, that's my jam. So yeah, check out the playlist.
I love it. Mine was the conversation you had with folks on the other side of the aisle to understand how they thought about and got to a point of wanting to act in their way, in their community. I just thought it was really, first of all, it wasn't getting done a lot. It was an audience that has often been ignored. And there are a lot of conservationists, and there are a lot of people that are passionate about aspects, but I think historically didn't feel invited to the conversation. And so it was just interesting and fun. And I sent that to a bunch of people and said, see, like, you do care. People are talking about it.
It was a fascinating conversation, in part because I'm going to blank on the names, which is so awful, but there's a former member of Congress, a Republican, who had advocated for environmental stuff, and he lost re-election in part because of it, which is not the outcome that we want, right? But became an advocate for environmental action within the conservative political arena, which is wonderful. And I think that work that he started is still going. And then a young Republican who was leading an organization for conservation efforts.
Was it Benji Becker?
Yeah, it was Benji. And a lot of the way I talk about environmental stuff is not, in my mind, political. And we know from polling, everyone wants clean air and clean water. That's nonpartisan, or it should be. And so there's a lot of room, of course, for collaboration when it comes to protecting ecosystems. There's a lot of attachment to place and to the, to the nature around us that we can protect together that doesn't have to be about politics. And I actually feel the same way about climate change. You don't even have to talk about the problem to work together on solutions, right? Think about Iowa and Texas, which have more wind energy than any other states in the U.S. It's not because they're the most rabid environmentalists. It's because it makes economic sense and they're good jobs and it's a really promising industry. And I think there's so much we can do. We don't need to argue about the causes. We just can focus on the solutions.
Well, we got to go.
Also, we don't have to argue about the causes because it's just facts. But we don't even have to have that part of the conversation.
Yeah. Before we get into the book, and this might be a good segue, the work that you're doing now, all the kind of fun projects you're doing now at Urban Ocean Lab, explain to folks the juxtaposition of urban and ocean lab, and also some of the cool projects that you do that are kind of based in cities where we don't immediately apply an environmental lens or certainly an ocean lens.
So for me, that concept, that organization that I co-founded grew out of what I'm sure we'll get to, like my own Venn diagram for climate action. This idea of like, okay, what am I good at? Okay, I have this PhD in marine biology. I should put that too somehow. I have some policy experience. I'm increasingly experienced in communication. Okay, so I've got this network. Okay, I'm bringing that to the table. And then what needs doing that like is a gap? So this Japanese concept of ikigai for finding your purpose, I think it's like 5 circles. I wasn't familiar with that when I sketched this out for myself. But this merging of like, what are you good at? What needs doing? Which in this case is climate and justice solutions.
Yeah.
And what I was seeing as a gap was what is happening in coastal cities. I grew up in Brooklyn, a coastal city. New York City has over 500 miles of coastline. It's an archipelago of islands. Right? I didn't think about it that way when I was a kid. I was like, I'm going to the Florida Keys to visit the ocean where it's turquoise and warm and there's all this colorful stuff happening. But there's seahorses in New York Harbor. There's whales coming through, right? There's sturgeon. There's all of this incredible marine life. And so thinking about coastal cities in part because, we crunched the numbers and 1 in 5 Americans live in a coastal city. If we can figure out how to adapt to coastal climate issues in coastal cities, that will benefit 20% of Americans and a huge portion of our economy, obviously. Right. And, 40% of Americans live in coastal counties. So this is not some coastal elite issue. In fact, it is a larger percentage of people who are low income, don't have college degrees, are renters, are first generation Americans who are living in these places. And like, we are just not prepared for sea level rise, for storms, how that's going to affect infrastructure, et cetera. But there are all these solutions that the ocean is trying to offer us, whether that's renewable offshore energy, primarily wind right now, protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems that are absorbing all this carbon, that are the nursery for fisheries species, that are physically protecting our coastline, often in cases better than seawalls and cheaper than seawalls. Regenerative farming in the ocean of seaweed and shellfish. All of these opportunities are still being under embraced. And then it's just the third circle of this Venn diagram is what brings you joy. And I was like, man, I love cities. I love design. I love changing the rules of the game in terms of policy. So like, obviously I should start a policy think tank for the future of coastal cities with 2 amazing co-founders, Marquis Stillwell, who's a designer, Jean Flemma, who worked on these issues in Congress for 24 years. And we've got a great little team writing a bunch of dorky but useful policy memos. And we've developed a resource hub with hundreds of resources curated, not just the ones that we've written, to help people think about climate-driven relocation and coastal ecosystems and offshore energy and infrastructure and all of these lessons learned from other projects, because we don't have time to reinvent the wheel. So this is one of our major projects and offerings. Okay,
so it's a good segue to the book.
All right, let's do it.
So the idea for the book came from when? From where? From how did this evolve? I mean, we should also plug your first book, which is a great series of essays from really interesting, diverse, brilliant people. I liked it because I didn't have to read all of them. I could just like pick and choose a few, and it was easy to like figure the ones out that would be most exciting to me. So you've written one book.
That one is called All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. I co-edited that anthology with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, and no one expected an anthology of climate essays, all written by women, to become a national bestseller. That was shocking to literally all of us, but wonderful. And it's been, used in over 100 universities across the country. So at least some of those people are actually reading the book and not just buying it, because they have to write essays about it. And that book has had just the most incredible life. But I signed a 2-book deal with One World imprint at Penguin Random House. And this book was actually supposed to come out first. And the anthology was supposed to be a side project, but it took on this incredible life of its own. And part of the reason it took me so much longer to write this book is because I wasn't writing it. And it wasn't just writer's block. It was sort of, I couldn't figure out the concept. I couldn't figure out the structure of it. Like, how do you write a climate book that doesn't feel like a textbook. And it took me a long while to unlock that. It initially was called How Humans Survive Humanity, which is sort of like dramatic.
That is dark.
It has a little darkness to it. And it was going to feel like a how-to textbook kind of thing, which I didn't really want to write, let alone read.
Right.
And so, I focus my energy on solutions, right? Like we have most of the solutions we need. How do we unlock the speed of implementing them is really the question. Like, how do we build the biggest, strongest team to go do this stuff? And there's an event series that I've hosted for years at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn, this wonderful arts institution, where I would bring in two experts with complementary knowledge, say a NASA climate scientist and an architect of the Green New Deal policy plan, or, someone advocating for the reduction of plastics use and a scientist studying the impacts of plastic around the world, or the chief librarian of the Brooklyn Public Library and the head of Wikipedia to talk about the future of public knowledge. All of these fascinating conversations. And my editor would come to these events. And finally, he came up to me after one and he was like, I know what the book is about. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? He's like, you've got a lot of people waiting to talk to you. I'll just tell you later. And I was like, tell me immediately. He was like, this is the book, Ayana. Like the thing that you do that is special is tell us who is important that we should be listening to and then understand what the hell they're saying. And I didn't take that literally at first. I was like, oh, I'm going to just talk to all these people and then I'll paraphrase. And I was like, I'm always so frustrated by books that are just paraphrasing what other people think. I'm like, why am I reading this? I should just go read their books.
Right.
And so I literally transcribed 20 interviews into this book. And you can get like what people who are listening to this are getting, which is this conversation between friends.
Yeah.
These are all the people who have helped me answer this title, What If We Get It Right question, who've helped me see the way forward, their visions of climate futures. And so I'm offering that to all of the readers, these sort of irreverent, deep, heartfelt, friendly, often lighthearted conversations about like sort of the mess we're in and how they can see us finding our way out of it and what we get at the other end. This book is very much like show me it's worth it kind of a book.
It does it masterfully.
Thank you.
Give us 2 minutes on how bad the mess is. I didn't want to do it, but I feel like it'll help contextualize.
So in the book, I actually limit that to a very short chapter called Reality Check, which is based on sort of when I'm at, say, cocktail parties, now that I know how to do them.
Thank you, Harvard.
Thank you, Harvard. Sort of late at night after people have had a few drinks, they often come up to me and sort of like whisper. They're like, okay, so how fucked are we? And I'm like, okay, pretty fucked, but like there's a whole bunch of stuff we should do. And like, let's just talk about that. So I usually avoid answering the question, but there's a few facts that I think might be useful to share. One is just thinking about last summer when the water in Florida surpassed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is literally jacuzzi temperatures.
Yeah.
I was like, this is in the place where I first learned to swim and decided to become a marine biologist, right? This was very jarring to me, thinking about how the ocean has absorbed about a third of the carbon dioxide we've emitted by burning fossil fuels, and that's changed the pH of the entire ocean. Like we have changed the chemistry of seawater globally is horrifying to me. And the ocean has absorbed over 90% of the heat that we've trapped with all those greenhouse gases blanketing the planet, which is causing all sorts of problems. I mean, all the species on this planet are evolved to live in a specific range of temperature, pH, salinity, humidity, all of that. And so we think of these changes
including humans.
Like there are places now where it is too hot to live outside for a significant portion of the year. People are dying because of the heat. And a lot of the work of Urban Ocean Lab over the next year is going to be thinking about what that means for climate-driven relocation. People are going to have to move away from places that are plagued by droughts and floods and wildfires and heat in ways that are just not livable anymore, and what that means for reshaping our society. So, yeah, I worry about the ocean stuff, but obviously there's, crop failures and food insecurity that's coming from this. We know that that's a source of conflict, of wars, of domestic violence. All of these things have ripple effects. I'm just looking at this page now. By 2070, not that many years from now, 1/5 of the planet could be as scorchingly hot as the rapidly expanding Sahara Desert. 20% of the planet. I mean, that is a wild transformation. So while we can't stop or solve climate change per se, there are still innumerable possible futures. There's a wide range of scenarios we could be living in 20, 30, 50 years. And what I want to do is help make sure we have the best possible one.
The other thing I think your book does nicely when it comes to this is every section has the problems and then the possibilities.
Yep. Side by side.
Side by side. And so
centerfold.
I think it's a great way of helping people understand the realities of the challenge, but also that
there's 10 minuses, 10 pluses. Yeah.
I love it.
One of my favorite possibilities in the book, actually, because it was so shocking to me, is that about 75% of the infrastructure that will be in place in 2050 has yet to be built.
Yeah.
Like, we are literally rebuilding the future every day. And we have a choice of how we build that. Do we build that in a way that is adapting to these changes that are coming, that are making the world more beautiful and delightful, right? I mean, one of the big what if questions I ask in the book is, what if climate adaptation is beautiful? I care so much about design, and I want it to be beautiful.
Yeah.
Like, if we're building all this stuff, I mean, for the love of God, like, don't make a bunch of ugly crap that's falling apart immediately. Like, let's do it right.
Yeah. You talk about sticking on that trend for a second. That infrastructure is now about to be built and is now funded to levels never before seen, thanks to a bunch of legislation in the last couple of years, IIJA, the IRA.
Do you want to tell people what those acronyms stand for, Conor? Inflation Reduction Act is one, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Yeah. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, the largest investment in climate anywhere on the planet ever.
Yeah. So there is a path, right?
I mean, it's a great start.
Yeah.
And electing politicians who get the stakes is critical.
Yeah.
Because all of that could unravel. And so, I mean, it's not hyperbole to say we either go on a path towards solving this crisis or we make it worse. But I think it's so important to also, when we think about climate policy and politics, to remember the down ballot races. To remember that our city council members are deciding, do we have municipal composting? Do we have bike lanes? Are our public utility commissioners moving towards renewables quickly?
A huge shout out to all public utility commissioners who are working hard.
We need you.
It's actually fascinating. We hosted an event in Georgia last year, and one of the most fascinating interactions was the PUC chair in Georgia, it's Georgia. She's a staunch Republican, saying we need to figure out, one of your other commenters in the book said this, transmission. We need to figure out transmission. We need to figure out how to do it for everybody, but we need to figure it out fast. Like, there's a lot of people that want to come to our state, that want to do things renewable in our state.
We can build all the solar panels we want, but if we can't connect them to transmission lines and the grid, which needs major upgrades, then it's not that helpful. So the person who said that in the book was Dr. Kate Marvel, NASA climate scientist. I asked her, what's the nerdiest, least sexy thing we need to do to get it right? And she was like, transmission lines.
Yeah. I mean, being in DC and amidst it every day, like, I'm optimistic we might get permitting reform started this year. I actually think it won't be perfect, but we might get it started.
I think the challenge with permitting reform.
There's many.
There are many challenges, but there's a lot of push for just making permitting anything easier, any kind of energy, including oil and gas pipelines, including fracking. Right. And we simply cannot invest any more in building out new fossil fuel infrastructure. That will be with us for decades. Right. That will, change the economics of what makes sense. That will be either a stranded asset or something that people are determined to keep using, right? And we have renewable energy now. We need to be building out that infrastructure specifically. And so figuring out how to do permitting reform that does not benefit fossil fuels is really the trick. And of course, given the politics, that's going to be really tricky.
Yeah. You do. I love the section in the book that talks to the business opportunity. And a lot of the folks that we've talked to on the podcast are building innovative companies and seeing incredible growth and like mind-blowing technology that, is finding new ways to capture carbon in natural climate ways.
Including our friend Frank Heidinger of Holloway and electric boats.
Yeah. So just the amount of smart money people, and the family office chapter with
Regine Clement from Creo
talks about this, that these are, family offices who are aggressively investing in long, deep tech, hard stuff that could make huge differences. I'm just kind of curious for your take on where the private sector fits.
I think this section is called Follow the Money, right? And it opens with a quote from Lauryn Hill. It's funny how money changes situation. Miscommunication leads to complication. I'm about to humble you on every station. I was only allowed to use one line. Fair use. The questions that I open that section with are, what if we reimagine capitalism regeneratively, right? We need to switch from a fossil fuel-based extractive economy to a regenerative one, which is transformation, right? This is not like tweaking stuff around the edges. Another question I ask is, what if companies lobby for climate policy, right? I remember sitting next to Senator Whitehouse at a gala once and asking him kind of like, what's going on in environmental policy? Like, what are people saying when they come to your office to talk to you and your team? And he was like, the good guys don't come to lobby on Capitol Hill. It is the companies that don't want regulation, who are like, let us pollute as much as we want. How dare you regulate us, that are coming to prevent climate policy. The people, the corporations who are already moving on this, who are already implementing solutions, who have voluntarily raised the bar for themselves, they're not coming to say, the bar is here, you could actually raise it to this level, it would be fine for everybody, like it's totally doable. They're not showing up.
That's interesting.
And so this question of like, what if companies lobbied for climate policy instead of always just trying to kill it? Obviously, these are different companies who would be doing that. But when you have the Chamber of Commerce as one of the most anti-environmental policy organizations in the US, incredibly powerful, that's a huge problem. We need a group of corporations who are like, actually, if we remember our Economics 101, the major input to all of our businesses is natural resources. So maybe we should get our act together and protect those, right? We need those people showing up, and we need banks to stop financing fossil fuels. Banks will be fine without that business. It is a small portion of their portfolio. And so, as Bill McKibben argues, we can move from targeting only fossil fuel corporations and just go straight to the banks that are funding them.
You're seeing this in Europe a lot. I think it's starting to take a bit of a foothold.
Better late than never, right? And this question of like, what if we considered the Earth a shareholder, which is what Patagonia did 2 years ago. I'm on the board there, so I was part of this as it was unfolding, transferring all of the shares essentially to a trust where all of the profits get directed towards environmental and climate causes. The business is still a for-profit business. People are still getting paid well. There are good benefits for working there, top of industry, in fact. And having a healthy business will allow more money to go into the environment because of a very specific thing. The owners of that company, the Chenards, said, we have enough. And that is a word you do not hear in business.
Yeah.
What is enough for us as individuals? What is enough wealth? What is enough privilege? What is enough success? And how after a certain point where you're like, literally, I've taken care of my family, my children, my grandchildren, my legacy. I want to be making life on this planet better in various ways. And I sort of get chills thinking about what the world could look like if we embrace this concept of enough. You've already won. Like, if you're a billionaire, you've won. At 1 billion, could you just call it good? And be like, I have enough money for literally anything I could possibly imagine. Let me shift my business model.
Yeah.
Let me think about what it really means to share instead of hoard. Nature doesn't hoard. Like we need to look to nature and ecosystems and that web of life for more inspiration, I think.
I do think, I hope, it feels like there's at least a strong plurality of people, and I surround myself with them, right, by definition, who are trying to use business and kind of you talk about in the book, like the size and power of capital to move things in a good direction. Because there's certain things that are too big for government to handle on its own that require kind of the trillions in private markets to take on. And it feels like there's movement that direction. There's passionate shareholders that are pushing for it. Again, I think when I get to talk to entrepreneurs who get this funding, who are part of Credo, every week for the podcast, and hear their stories and hear what they're doing and hear what the potential impact could be, that is both a huge ROI impact for them or for their shareholders, but also like potentially transformative to adaptation, mitigation.
There's a lot of money to be made in climate solutions.
I mean, there are a ton of smart venture capitalists who are saying the next unicorns will be climate technologists.
There's one stat in the book that's due to the favorable economics of renewables, decarbonizing the energy system by 2050 could save up to $15 trillion.
Yeah.
The economics of this whole thing are changing very quickly. And I guess I would say, while we're talking about money, there are two things I think I'd like for people to know. One is, please pay your taxes. Like, as much as corporations have a huge role to play, governments, all levels of government, we need them. That societal transformation is happening with public money, right? For overhauling our public transit systems, that's taxpayer money, right? We cannot decarbonize transportation just based on the private sector. This is not about everyone having an electric car. This is about high-speed rail, right? This is about larger infrastructure questions, for example. The other thing I would say is where you put your money really matters. There's, I can find this quickly. There's like asterisks in here in the book, in the margins.
I love that structure, by the way. It's so smart.
I'm not going to be able to find it.
Annotated this for you when you read it, like with interesting points, key things to go back and look up, things that make you smile.
Okay. If you have $125,000 in the bank, say saved for your retirement, that money in the bank, if it is not in a climate-friendly fund, is doing more harm than any amount of good you could do by lowering your personal carbon footprint. Whether you eat only plants and only walk and bike, that doesn't matter if your money is invested in fossil fuels, in the expansion of fossil fuels, which if you're in like a regular 401k, IRA, mutual fund, it almost certainly is. Right. And so I would really encourage people that the like easiest way to make a big difference in your personal life as an individual is to make sure your money is not invested in fossil fuels.
Yeah.
But in the alternatives specifically.
And I love his approach of like looking locally. I think that's really a paradigm shift that's interesting to dig into.
Yeah. And I would just say like the extension of that is that for corporations, where your money is, if you actually factor that into your carbon emissions balance sheet, you can find, especially for tech companies, especially with the rise of AI, it blows all of their estimates of their carbon footprint out of the water because we're starting to see, they have hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in the bank that are sitting there. And it's banks like, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citi, JP Morgan Chase. Those are the four biggest American banks that are funding fossil fuels. Yeah. And so if we're putting our money in there, some percentage of it is going there now, and there are more and more options to avoid that. And the more corporations are demanding from their banks better options that are not making the problem worse, the better off we'll be.
I want to end by trying to inspire hope in folks,
which
is controversial. Ayana said there's a whole chapter, a note about it.
A note on hope.
But I think it's, I think a lot of folks, and I ask everyone this question, the headlines are bad, and they're bad every day. And I think for some of us, you see that every day, and it's defeating, and you feel like, what's the point of trying?
Yeah.
So the question I usually ask is, how do we defeat defeatism? But since you have a whole note on hope, what is your take on how we should think about hope?
Personally, I don't like the word. hope. I'm often labeled as an optimist, which I find sort of jarring because I'm not. I'm a scientist. I'm a realist. Like, I've seen the projections, right? I know that a very bad outcome is a serious possibility for humanity,
right,
for life on Earth, because we don't have a good history as a species of collaborating, of getting our act together and really charging ahead towards solutions in a timely manner. There are examples of that, like the Montreal Protocol and dealing with the ozone layer and banning the chemicals that were causing that. But those examples are sort of few and far between. I mean, we've had how many decades of UN climate negotiations? And it was only last year that we got the first mention of the need to reduce fossil fuels in writing that everyone could agree to. So that process is important, but incredibly slow. So hope is not my first instinct. However, possibility exists. That is undeniable, right? There are many different possible futures. And so that is a word that I embrace wholeheartedly. And, we can all do something to make those better possible futures, to reel those closer into existence. So while a word like optimism has some expectation definitionally built into it that things are going to be okay in the end, I'm not sure what they're going to be like in the end, but I kind of don't even worry about it. Because if I contribute, if I do my part, if I figure out my Venn diagram of what am I good at, what needs doing, what brings me joy, and just live at that sweet spot for as many minutes of life as I can, I will have no regrets. I will have done my part, I will have tried, and that will feel good even though I can't control the outcome. And so I guess I feel like hope is sort of a weak motivator. It's insufficient and it can be quite passive because when we think of hope, it's like, I hope that works out. I hope someone does something about that.
Yeah.
I hope it's okay in the end. And it's like, fuck hope. Show me your strategy. What are we going to do so we don't need hope, right? Who's doing what? Let's go. Like, let's implement, right? I'm just immediately an action-oriented person. And I think more of us we all need to figure out where we can be useful, focus on being useful instead of being hopeful, how we can roll up our sleeves and pitch in and see what kind of world we can build together.
I think that's a perfect place to end.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Rumi. This is such a treat.
20 some years ago.
I know.
Somehow my TikTok has become populated with Harvard Acapella again recently, and I don't know where it came from or why.
Send me the links.
I will.
Apparently, I'm on TikTok now, unfortunately.
I saw.
Yeah.
Follow Ayana everywhere.
Yeah.
We'll put all of your socials in the...
At Ayana Eliza. I will say the website for the book, I spent a lot of time working on, getitright.earth. There's lots of resources, references, information, Venn diagram, worksheet, etc. on there for folks. All the problems and possibilities are on the website with hyperlinks to the sources if people want to dig in and get nerdy with it.
And but this will come out right as the book comes out, I think. We'll make sure to link to where folks can pick up their copy.
Yeah. And there's a whole tour. 19 cities,
You're in
6
DC
weeks.
twice.
I'm in DC
once
twice.
Once October.
Yeah. Come hang.
I'll come see you.
Okay.
Oh.
Love you, Conor.
We can cut, guys.
Once again, my deepest thanks to my dear friend, Dr. Ayana Johnson, for joining me on Consensus in Conversation this week. So if you want to learn more about Ayana's latest book, and once again, the book is called What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures, you can visit the website getitright.earth, which will have all the information about contributors, tour dates, further reading lists, and of course, where you can pick up a copy. If you want to learn more about all of Ayana's other awesome work, you can check out her website at ayanaelizabeth.com. And she's at Ayana Eliza on all the socials. That's Instagram, Twitter, and now apparently TikTok. And of course, you don't have to memorize all that. We'll have it for you in the show notes. As always, you can email us at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. You can also message me directly on LinkedIn and Threads at ckgaughan. That's at ckgaughan. Send us your questions, comments, ideas for future guests. We love getting the feedback. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It's so helpful with growing our reach and adding new people to the conversation. It helps us to continue bringing you more of the awesome talks with business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We're back next week with a brand new conversation. Consensus in Conversation is hosted by me, Conor Gaughan, and executive produced by me and Jeff Rock. Our producer is Will Gatchell, with editing by the team at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker and Greg Harrigal on research. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.